Hello there, welcome to HFY Sci-Fi Galaxy, where humans face the unknown, outsmart the impossible, and turn every test into victory. So sit back and let the story begin.
The broadcast played on every screen across 37 worlds, and not a single soul changed the channel that a woman walked barefoot across a stone platform in the central square of Orith, capital of the Drithani sovereignty. She was tall and silver-skinned, her long white hair pulled back, her hands bound in front of her with glowing restraints. Around her, thousands of Drithani citizens watched from elevated balconies and open courtyards, their pale faces tight with obedience rather than anger. Her name was Suri Renner. Before her marriage, she had been Suri Olani, a healer from the lower districts of Orith, known for treating the sick regardless of species. Now she was a traitor. That was what the court had decided in a trial that lasted less than 6 hours. The charges were conspiracy against the sovereignty. The evidence was sealed. No defense had been permitted that a Drithani official in dark ceremonial robes read the sentence aloud. His voice echoed through the square, amplified by hovering drones that carried the signal to every corner of the empire and beyond. He spoke of duty, of loyalty, of the dangers posed by those who allowed alien influence to corrupt Drithani purity. Suri listened without expression. When the official finished, the executioner stepped forward and placed a loop around her neck. The old method. The Drithani had always believed in tradition that a small microphone was extended toward her. One final statement. Most condemned prisoners wept or cursed or begged. Suri did neither. She looked directly into the broadcast lens and said 7 words. "Tell him I kept my promise." The floor dropped. The feed cut to black. Billions watched. None reacted. She was just another political death in a distant empire that meant nothing to them. 6 days later, and half a galaxy away, a man named Davi Renner knelt in the dirt beside a broken water pump on a farm that barely produced enough to feed 2 people. The planet was called Baron's Reach, a dusty colony on the far edge of Terran-controlled space where nothing important ever happened. Davi was 53 years old. His hair had gone gray early. He walked with a slight limp in his left leg, a gift from a piece of shrapnel he never had properly removed. His hands were calloused from years of manual work, and his face had the kind of stillness that came from a man who had learned long ago to keep his thoughts behind his eyes. His neighbors knew him as a retired soldier who had married an alien woman and settled down to grow dry weather crops. A quiet man, polite, kept to himself. The shuttle landed at the edge of his property just after midday, kicking dust into the hot wind. Davi watched it settle and waited. He did not get many visitors that a young woman climbed out. She wore the light, gray uniform of Terran intelligence, and she looked uncomfortable in the heat. Her name was Rena Goss. She was 26, sharp-eyed, and had been stationed on a relay post 3 systems over when her commanding officer handed her a sealed file and told her to find this man. She walked across the dry ground to where Davi stood by his pump. She introduced herself and showed her credentials. Davi wiped his hands on his trousers and nodded. Rena hesitated. She had rehearsed this on the shuttle, but now, standing in front of him, the words felt wrong. There was no right way to say it. "Sir, I have been asked to inform you that 6 days ago, your wife, Suri Renner, was executed by public hanging on the Drithani capital world of Orith. She was convicted of treason against the Drithani sovereignty." Davi looked at her. His face did not change. His eyes did not blink. Rena continued because the silence was unbearable. The trial was conducted without proper defense. Our analysts believe the charges were politically motivated. High Magistrate Peller has been consolidating power for the past year, targeting individuals with cross-species ties. 17 others have been imprisoned or killed under similar circumstances. Davi said nothing for a long time. The wind moved the dust around their feet. Somewhere behind the farmhouse, a gate creaked on a broken hinge. Then he asked one question. Was it lawful? Rena shook her head. No, sir. By any standard, it was not. He nodded once. He turned and walked into his house and closed the door behind him. Rena stood alone in the dust, unsure of what to do. She waited. 10 minutes. 20. An hour. The door opened again. Davi stepped out. He had changed his clothes. He wore an old Terran military jacket, faded and patched at the elbows, with a rank insignia so worn it was barely visible. His boots were scuffed but lace tight. He had a small bag over one shoulder, and he looked at Rena with the same steady expression, but something behind his eyes had shifted. It was not rage. It was not grief. It was something older and quieter and far more dangerous. "I need a ship," he said. Rena opened her mouth to explain that she was not authorized to provide transportation for personal matters, that there were procedures and chains of command and diplomatic considerations. But she stopped, because something in the way this man stood, in the way the air seemed to tighten around him, told her that procedures were not going to matter. "Yes, sir," she said. Rena Goss had read a lot of military files in her short career, but none of them made her hands shake until now. She sat in the co-pilot seat of the shuttle as it climbed away from Baron's Reach, the brown planet shrinking behind them. Davi sat across the aisle with his eyes closed, his small bag at his feet, his breathing so slow, and even he might have been asleep. He was not asleep. Rena had pulled his service record the moment they broke atmosphere, using her intelligence clearance to access files that were supposed to be archived and forgotten. What she found made her sit very still for a very long time. Commander Davi Renner. Terra Naval Command, 9th Strike Group. During the Galactic Unification War, the 9th Strike Group had been a small, fast formation assigned to impossible missions that no one expected to survive. Under Davi's command, they did not just survive. They won. Every single time that he broke the Sethari siege at Gallows Gate with 14 ships against 60. He liberated 3 occupied systems in 9 days. He led the final assault on the Sethari command station, walking through the wreckage himself to accept the enemy admiral's surrender. His call sign was Howling Wind, because that was what enemy communications called him when they detected his fleet, a howling wind that destroyed everything it touched. After the war, the Terran Republic offered him a promotion to admiral. He declined. They offered him a seat on the Defense Council. He declined. They offered him a medal in a public ceremony broadcast to 100 worlds. He declined that he married a Drathani healer named Suri Olani and vanished. No forwarding address. No public record. The galaxy moved on, and the name Davi Renner faded into a footnote in a war that most people preferred to forget. Rena looked across the shuttle at the gray-haired man, sitting with his eyes closed, and tried to connect him to the officer in those files. The man who commanded fleets. The man who made admirals flinch. He looked like a farmer. He looked tired, but he had put on the jacket. She contacted Admiral Bryn Hale through a secure channel. Hale was Davi's oldest surviving friend from the war, now one of the highest-ranking officers in Terran Command. When Rena told her that Davi Renner was on a shuttle and moving, Hale went quiet for almost 30 seconds. "Where is he going?" Hale asked. "He has not told me." "Admiral, is he angry?" "No," I admitted. "He is calm." Another pause. Then Hale said, "That is worse. Keep me informed. And Goss, do not get in his way." The shuttle docked at Port Callaway, a trade hub station on the border between Terran and neutral space. It was a loud, crowded place full of merchants, refugees, and people who preferred not to be found. Davi moved through the crowds without hurrying, his eyes scanning with the habit of a man who had spent decades reading rooms for threats. He found who he was looking for in a small cargo office on the station's lower level. A Palori merchant named Doak, barely 4 feet tall with 4 arms and skin like polished wood, who ran a modest shipping operation between 6 systems. Doak had been a friend of the Renner family for over a decade. He had helped Davi and Suri disappear after the war, moving their belongings through back channels and keeping their location out of any database. Doak already knew about Suri. He sat Davi down in his cluttered office, closed the door, and told him everything he had gathered. High Magistrate Peller had launched a political purge within the Drathani sovereignty over the past year. Anyone with ties to other species, especially humans, was being targeted. Cultural leaders, merchants, diplomats, healers. Anyone who represented the idea that the Drathani could live alongside aliens was being removed. Suri had been the most visible target. A Drathani woman who married a human. Peller made an example of her. He wanted it public, Doak said, his 4 hands folded together tightly. He wanted every Drathani citizen to see what happens when you cross the line he drew. Davi listened to all of it. He asked questions, specific questions, names, dates, document numbers, communication logs. Doak answered what he could and promised to find the rest. When it was done, Davi stood and thanked him. Doak looked up at him with dark, wet eyes. Davi, what are you going to do? Davi considered the question as if it deserved careful thought. Then he said, I'm going to keep a promise. He walked out of the office and back into the noise of the station. Rena was waiting outside, pretending she had not been trying to listen through the door. She fell in a step beside him and asked where they were going next. Davi did not look at her. He walked steadily toward the communication wing of the station, where long-range signal arrays could reach half the galaxy. I need to talk to some old friends, he said. Rena watched his face as he walked. There was no fury in it. No tensión. No trembling jaw or clenched fists. He moved like a man with a clear schedule and no intention of being late. And that, she was beginning to understand, was the most frightening thing about him. 3 weeks passed, and Davi Renner did not raise his voice once. He worked out a rented room on Port Callaway, a small space with a desk, a cot, and a communications terminal that Doak had modified to handle encrypted signals. The room smelled like recycled air and old metal. Davi did not seem to notice or care. Every morning he woke before the station lights shifted to daytime mode. He washed his face, put on the same faded uniform jacket, and sat down at the terminal. He sent messages. He received messages. He read documents. He made notes on a datapad in handwriting so small and neat it looked printed that he was not building an army. Rena had expected him to call in warships, to rally old soldiers, to start rattling weapons. He did none of that. Instead, he was building something far more dangerous. He was building a case. Through old intelligence contacts who still owed him favors, he obtained the full records of Suri's trial. Every word of testimony, every document submitted as evidence, every signature on every order. He laid them out piece by piece and studied them with the patience of a man defusing a bomb. The fabrication was not even clever. The charges claimed Suri had passed sensitive Drethani military information to a foreign agent. The foreign agent was never named. The military information was never specified. The 3 witnesses who testified against her had all been transferred to new positions within days of the trial. Positions that came with significant pay increases and housing upgrades. One of the witnesses, a low-ranking clerk named Orith, had a brother who was in prison for unpaid debts. The brother was released the morning after Suri's conviction. Davi documented everything. Names, dates, financial transfers, communication timestamps. He cross-referenced Drethani public records with data Doak pulled from shipping manifests and trade logs. The picture that emerged was clear and ugly. High Magistrate Peller had not just killed Suri. He had run a systematic operation to eliminate anyone in Drethani society who represented cooperation with humans. 17 people in total. Some executed, some imprisoned, some simply disappeared. Suri was the most public because her marriage to a human made her the most useful symbol. Rena watched Davi work and said very little. She brought him food that he sometimes forgot to eat. She forwarded intelligence updates from her own channels. She answered his questions when he had them, which was not often. One evening, she could not keep quiet anymore. Sir, what is the plan? Are you going to present this to the Galactic Council? Davi did not look up from his datapad. No. Why not? The evidence is overwhelming. The council is slow. They will form a committee. The committee will request a review. The review will take months. During those months, Peller will destroy evidence and silence anyone who might talk. By the time the council acts, there will be nothing left to act on. Rena frowned. Then what? Davi set down the datapad and looked at her for the first time in hours. His eyes were steady and clear, the kind of eyes that had once stared down enemy fleets without blinking. Do you know how I met Suri? He asked. Rena shook her head. It was during the liberation of Relay Station 14. The Sethari had used it as a detention facility. When we breached the station, we found over 200 prisoners, most of them barely alive. Suri was there. She had been captured 6 months earlier while running a medical outpost near the front lines. When we found her, she was treating the other prisoners with supplies she had stolen from the guards. Drithani, human, Palori. She did not care what species they were. He paused. There was a firefight in the corridor outside the medical bay. Crossfire. A wounded Drithani soldier was caught in the open. Suri walked out into the shooting, unarmed, and dragged him to cover. She did not hesitate. She did not ask which side he was on. Rena waited. She believed the galaxy could be better than it is, Davi said quietly. She believed that if you showed people kindness without conditions, they would eventually learn to do the same. She spent her entire life proving that. He picked up the datapad again. I do not share her optimism, but I love her for it. And I will not let the man who killed her hide behind politics and paperwork. So what do you believe in? Rena asked. Consequences, he said. The next day, Admiral Bryn Hale contacted Davi directly through a military-grade encrypted channel. She had been watching from a distance, and she was worried. Davi, let me help. I can move the 4th Fleet to the border. A show of force. The Drithani will fold. No, Davi said. Why the hell not? Because if the fleet moves, it becomes a military confrontation. The Drithani will claim aggression. Their allies will rally. What should be about justice becomes about territory and pride. Suri did not die, so I could start a war. Hale was quiet for a moment. Then what happens if the Drithani see you as a threat anyway? Davi looked at the screen. His expression did not change, but something in his voice dropped half a degree. Then, they will remember why they should not have forgotten. He cut the channel. That night, Rena passed by his room and saw light under the door. She paused and listened. There was no sound, no movement, just silence. She almost knocked. She did not. Inside, Davi sat on the edge of his cot, holding a small holographic image of Suri in both hands. She was laughing in the image, her silver skin catching light, her eyes bright. He held it the way a man holds the last thing he has left in the world. His hands were shaking. Doak was the first to notice that the Drithani broadcast network had a flaw. It was not a technical flaw. The system was heavily encrypted, well-maintained, and monitored around the clock by sovereignty engineers. The flaw was human, or rather Drithani. The broadcast infrastructure relied on relay stations spread across dozens of worlds, and those relay stations were operated by low-level technicians who were underpaid, overworked, and deeply unhappy with the current government. 3 of those technicians had family members among the 17 people Peller's Purge had imprisoned or killed. Doak found them. He did not offer money. He told them what Davi was planning, and he asked if they wanted to help. All 3 said yes before he finished the question that IT took 11 days to prepare. Davi reviewed every detail personally. He recorded his message in a single take, sitting in the rented room on Port Callaway with the gray wall behind him and the faded jacket on his shoulders. No script, no teleprompter. He spoke from memory, and his memory was perfect. Rena handled the signal routing, using her intelligence training to mask the origin point so the Drithani could not trace it in time to stop it. Doak coordinated the relay technicians. Everything had to happen simultaneously across all channels, or the sovereignty sensors would cut the feed before it reached every world at exactly midday or a standard time. The same hour Suri had been executed, every screen in the Drithani sovereignty went dark for 3 seconds. Then Davi's face appeared that he looked into the lens the way he had once looked across a battlefield. Calm, focused, absolute. My name is Davi Renner, he said. Commander, Terra Naval Command, 9th Strike Group. Service number 7714. Some of you may not know that name. I will remind you. He recited his record, not with pride, not with anger, with the flat, factual tone of a man reading coordinates before strike. Koloskota, the liberation of the Ven systems, the assault on the Sethari command station, every battle, every enemy fleet destroyed, every impossible victory that had once made the entire galaxy hold its breath. And then he stopped talking about war. 20 years ago, I met a woman named Suriolani on a refugee station in the middle of a conflict zone. She was a healer. She treated wounded soldiers of every species without asking whose side they were on. She walked in a gunfire to save a man she had never met. She was the bravest person I have ever known, and I have known soldiers who charged enemy battleships with nothing but a prayer. His voice did not waver. His eyes did not move from the lens. I married her. We built a life together. She continued to heal people. She continued to believe that kindness was stronger than fear. And 39 days ago, High Magistrate Peller of the Drethani Sovereignty had her arrested, tried in a sham court with no defense permitted, and publicly executed on charges that were fabricated from nothing. He began presenting the evidence, document by document, testimony by testimony. He showed the forged communications, the bribed witnesses, the financial transfers that paid for silence. He showed the records of 16 other victims, their names and faces, their families, the lives Peller had destroyed to consolidate his power. The galaxy watched that on Orith. Peller's aides scrambled to cut the broadcast. They could not. The relay technicians had locked the system open, and by the time Sovereignty engineers overrode the locks, the message had already reached every Drethani world and spilled into the wider galactic network. News agencies picked it up. Independent stations rebroadcast it. Within an hour, it was playing on worlds that had never heard of the Drethani sovereignty. Davi continued. Magistrate Peller, he said, looking directly into the lens as if Peller were standing in front of him. You killed a healer. You killed a woman who saved Drethani lives. You killed her because she loved a human, and you thought that made her weak. You thought that made her a symbol you could use. A pause. One breath. You were wrong. He did not threaten. He did not promise destruction. Instead, he did something Peller had never expected. He invoked Article 19 of the post-war Galactic Accord, the clause of individual accountability, a provision written into the peace treaties that allowed any citizen of a signatory nation who had been wronged by the government of another signatory nation to demand a public tribunal. The tribunal would be overseen by neutral parties, conducted in full transparency, and its verdict would be legally binding, and no signatory had ever used it. Most had forgotten it existed. I am formally invoking Article 19, Davi said. I demand a public tribunal to examine the arrest, trial, and execution of Suri Renner. If the Drethani sovereignty refuses, they are in violation of the Galactic Accord. And if they are in violation, every protection that Accord provides them, including Terran defense guarantees, is void. He let that settle. You have 30 standard days to respond. The screen went black. Across the galaxy, in government halls and military command centers and homes and trading posts, people sat in stunned silence. On Orith, Peller stood in his office, his silver face drained of color, staring at the dark screen. And on Port Callaway, Davi Renner turned off the recording equipment, sat down on his cot, and pressed his hands together until the shaking stopped. The first crack appeared within hours that a Drethani naval admiral named Sev Torath, who had served during the Unification War and remembered exactly what the name Howling Wind meant, contacted Terran Command through a private back channel. His message was short. Is Renner acting alone? Or does he have fleet support? Admiral Bryn Hale received the message personally. She spent 20 minutes choosing her words before responding. Commander Renner is acting as a private citizen exercising his legal rights under the Galactic Accord. However, the Terran Republic takes treaty obligations very seriously, and any violation of the Accord by a signatory nation would be reviewed at the highest levels of our government and military. It was the most carefully worded non-answer in the history of galactic diplomacy. It said nothing. It implied everything. And it spread through Drethani military channels like fire through dry grass. The older Drethani officers understood. They had fought in the war. They had seen human fleets in action. They had watched Davi Renner turn 14 ships into a force that shattered 60, and they had never fully stopped looking over their shoulders since. The younger officers, the ones who had grown up in peacetime, had been told that humans were a fading species content with their small colonies. Now, they were learning that their elders flinched at a single human name. Peller dismissed all of it. He stood before the Drethani High Council and declared the broadcast an act of foreign interference. He called Davi a war criminal, using legal tricks to bully a sovereign nation. He demanded that the council reject the Article 19 challenge and issue a formal protest to the Terran Republic. The council listened politely. Then they asked questions Peller did not want to answer. Where was the evidence used in Suri Renner's trial? Peller said it was classified. Why was no defense permitted? Peller said the urgency of the threat required a swift process. Why had 3 witnesses received significant financial benefits immediately after testifying? Peller said that was a coincidence. The council members looked at each other. They were politicians, not soldiers, and they understood political survival better than anyone. The broadcast had been seen by billions. The evidence was now public. Every news agency in the galaxy was running the story. If the Drithani refused the tribunal, they would be seen as treaty breakers, and the protections they depended on would evaporate. Peller's allies began to distance themselves. Quietly at first, a missed meeting here, an unanswered communication there. Then openly, one by one, the officials who had supported his purge began issuing statements expressing concern about due process and the rule of law, as though they had not personally signed the orders that on Port Callaway. Doak monitored the collapse in real time, feeding updates to Davi through encrypted channels. He reported that 2 of Peller's senior advisors had fled Orith. 3 more had begun cooperating with internal investigators. Documents were surfacing faster than they could be destroyed. Rena sat with Davi in his room as the reports came in. She watched his face for some sign of satisfaction, some flicker of triumph. There was none. "Is this what you wanted?" she asked. Davi set down his datapad. Suri would have wanted the tribunal. She believed in justice. She believed that if you put the truth in front of people, they would choose to do the right thing. He paused. "I'm giving her that chance." Rena nodded slowly. "And if they don't? If the council rejects the challenge anyway?" "They will not." "How can you be sure?" "Because Peller's people are already running. Frightened people do not stand together. They scatter. And the council knows that if they protect Peller now, they inherit everything he has done. No politician in the galaxy wants to stand in front of a camera and explain why they defended a man who fabricated treason charges to murder a healer. He was right. On the 22nd day of the 30-day deadline, the Drithani High Council voted to accept the Article 19 challenge. The vote was unanimous, not because they believed in justice, but because they believed in self-preservation. Peller was arrested by his own security forces that evening. He was found in his private residence, attempting to destroy the last of his personal records. They let him out in restraints, past the same courtyard where Suri had been hanged. The irony was not lost on anyone. That night, Rena found Davi standing alone in the observation corridor of Port Callaway, staring through the wide viewport at the stars. His hands were clasped behind his back, his shoulders straight, his face unreadable. She stood beside him without speaking. After a long silence, Davi reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and took out the small holographic image of Suri. He held it in his open palm, and the light from the stars mixed with the soft glow of her laughing face. "She planted a garden at the farm," he said quietly, "before she left to visit her family on Orith. She said she wanted something beautiful to come home to." His voice was steady. His hands were not. Rena looked at the image. Suri was radiant in it, silver skin glowing, eyes full of life, caught in a moment of pure happiness. "She never came home," Davi said. That he closed his hand gently around the image and put it back in his pocket. Then he straightened his jacket and turned away from the viewport. "The tribunal convenes in 9 days," he said. "There is work to do." He walked back toward his room without looking back, and Rena let him go, because she understood that some grief was too heavy to share and too sacred to watch. The tribunal was held on Neutral Station Arbeth, a diplomatic post that orbited a dead star on the border between 3 territories. It had been built specifically for moments like this, moments when the galaxy needed a place that belonged to no one. Delegations arrived from 31 worlds. Representatives from the Galactic Council took their seats along curved benches. Journalists filled every available corner, their recording equipment casting small red lights across the chamber like scattered embers. Drithani officials sat on one side, their silver faces carefully blank. Terran observers sat on the other, equally composed. Davi Renner sat alone at a small table in the center of the room. He wore the same faded jacket. He carried no legal team, no advisors, no documents in his hands. Everything had already been submitted. Peller was brought in under guard. He looked smaller than he had on the broadcasts. His ceremonial robes had been replaced with plain gray clothing, and his wrists were bound. He did not look at Davi. He looked at the floor. The tribunal lasted 4 days. The evidence was presented methodically. Every forged document, every bribed witness, every financial record that traced the corruption back to Peller's office. Independent analysts confirmed that the communications used to convict Suri had been fabricated. The metadata was inconsistent, the encryption signatures did not match, and the supposed foreign agent she had contacted did not exist in any database of any intelligence service in the galaxy. One by one, the 3 witnesses who had testified against Suri were brought forward. Under questioning by neutral investigators, all 3 recanted. 1. The clerk named Orith broke down entirely and described in detail how he had been threatened and bribed. His brother would be sent back to prison. His family would lose their home. He had no choice. Davi listened to all of it in silence. He did not speak during the proceedings. He did not need to. The evidence spoke with a voice louder than any he could have raised on the 3rd day. The tribunal heard testimony about the other 16 victims of Peller's purge. Families came forward. Friends, colleagues. They told stories of people who had been taken in the night, tried in secret, and erased from public record. A teacher who had hosted a cultural exchange with human students. A merchant who had traded with Terran colonies. A musician who had performed in an interspecies festival. That Suri's story was told last. Not by Davi. He had not asked to speak. That it was told by a Drathani woman named Lura, who had been Suri's closest friend on Orith. She described Suri's medical work in the lower districts, how she had treated hundreds of patients for free, how she had opened a small clinic that served anyone regardless of species. She described the night Suri was arrested, how the security forces came to her family home, how they dragged her out while her elderly mother screamed, how Suri told her mother to be calm because the truth would protect her. Lura's voice broke when she said that. She paused, collected herself, and finished. The truth did not protect her, but it is protecting her now. The chamber was silent. On the 4th day, the tribunal delivered its verdict. High Magistrate Peller was found guilty of fabrication of evidence, corruption of judicial process, abuse of sovereign authority, and the unlawful execution of Suri Renner and 4 others whose deaths were directly linked to his orders. He was sentenced to permanent exile from Drathani space, stripped of all rank, title, and assets, and barred from holding any position of authority for the remainder of his life. The 16 surviving victims of his purge were formally exonerated. Their records were cleared. Their families were granted official apologies by the Drathani government. Suri Renner was declared innocent. When the verdict was read, Davi nodded once. That was all. He did not stand. He did not celebrate. He sat at his small table and nodded, and then he closed his eyes for a moment, and the chamber full of diplomats and journalists and military officers watched a quiet man grieve in the only private way left to him. Afterward, the station emptied slowly. Delegations departed. Journalists filed their reports. The story would dominate galactic news for weeks, and the reforms it triggered within the Drathani sovereignty would be studied for decades. Davi stood at a viewport, looking out at the dead star. Rena found him there, as she always seemed to. "What will you do now?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, her last words, "Tell him I kept my promise." Do you know what that meant? Rena shook her head. When we married, we made promises to each other. Not the formal ones, private ones. She promised me that she would never hide who she was or who she loved, no matter what it cost her. She promised she would never be ashamed of choosing a life that crossed the lines other people drew. He touched the pocket where the holographic image rested. She kept that promise, even on the gallows, even at the end. And yours? Rena asked softly. I promised her that if anyone ever made her pay for being brave, I would make sure the galaxy knew her name, that they would know what she stood for and what was done to her. He looked at Rena with eyes that were red but dry. She kept hers. Now I have kept mine. Doak arrived an hour later with a small cargo shuttle. He offered to take Davi home. Davi accepted without hesitation. There was nothing left for him here. No fame to collect. No politics to play. No career to rebuild. Rena watched them board the shuttle. She raised her hand in a half wave, and Davi returned it with a small nod that said more than words could. The shuttle pulled away from Arbeth Station and turned toward the distant, unremarkable speck of light that was Baron's reach. Years later, on the Drithani homeworld of Orith, a child sat in a history classroom listening to a teacher explain the Renner Tribunal. The teacher described how one man had used the law instead of weapons, how he had shaken an empire with evidence and a treaty clause, and how the reforms that followed had changed Drithani society forever. The child raised her hand. What happened to the human? The teacher smiled. No one really knows. He went home. He was never heard from again. The child's grandmother stood in the doorway, listening. She had been alive during the war. She remembered the name Howling Wind. She remembered the fear it carried. She leaned close to the child and whispered, "The galaxy forgot him once. It would be wise not to forget again." Outside the classroom window, the stars burned on, indifferent and endless. And somewhere among them, on a dusty farm on a planet that did not matter to anyone, a man tended a garden his wife had planted, and the flowers still grew.